Welcome to episode 10, Health, Wealth, and the Ultimate Self. Dr. Nutt, Dr. Rayner back here. It's been a minute. Apologize for the break. We've had some good things going on that we had to just continue to put energy into. But what's our episode talking about today?
So today we're going to talk about neurodevelopmental disorders. We're going to talk a little bit about mitochondrial health. We'll talk a little bit about what causes them and why they're happening so much more frequently now than they were 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 40 years ago. And I think when we talk about these things, there's two major things that we want to hit on today. Is number one, like what is causing it, and what might be driving the increase and the rapid increase in autistic spectrum disorders, ADHD, OCD, tic disorders, movement disorders, childhood, like there's even things called like PANS or PANDAS. PANDAS is pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder associated with strep, which is
Say
the
that
longest.
3 times fast, please. Do
Yeah,
it.
PANDAS.
It's not the cool bear that eats bamboo.
Not little teddy bears, but definitely something that's not to be messed around with. It's a really, really unfortunate, terrifying thing that happens that parents are not getting very many answers about. And
yeah, I mean, it's interesting because if you look 10 years ago, Dr. Cunningham put a lot of the research on the map, aka if you want to test for it, one of the tests is called the Cunningham panel. There's tests for it to show that you would have dopamine-driven like antibodies. You could prove it, yet it still wasn't really widely accepted within the pediatric community. Yet there's answers for it. Now, fast forward, it's more recognized, but still poorly recognized on the whole as a solution. Because again, if somebody has a flare-up, the actual treatment to calm some of the flare-up might actually be an antibiotic.
Sure.
And so, again, this is just one of those things where hopefully we get some awareness about it. But yeah, it needs to be evolved.
Yeah.
So in terms of neurobehavioral disorders, let's kind of go through, like, what are the top ones that are out there that people will be familiar with?
For sure.
Yeah.
I think everyone's understands like, ADD and ADHD. ADD is technically no longer a diagnosis. It's all under the umbrella of ADHD, with 3 different categorizations, basically one with attention deficit and one with hyperactivity, another one with hyperactivity only and attention seems to be okay, or one with attention only issues and hyperactivity is not a problem. So it's all under the category of ADHD now. And it's pretty wild because the rates of ADHD just keep going up and up and up and up, and it's really one of those things that I think when we look at it, it's so multifactorial that it's difficult for modern medicine to treat, because modern medicine is one symptom, one solution, one medication. And I think it needs, in just all neurological disorders, whether it's developmental, acquired, like a brain injury, or
so let's stop there. So why don't we just kind of go through like developmental versus acquired? You already touched on it, but just show the difference.
Yeah, well, developmental there would be something going on early, right?
Yeah.
There would be something, maybe from and this was something we're going to talk with you about, is like the development from a functional medicine standpoint, or development of physiological problems that are hampering the brain from developing appropriately, versus something that's acquired from like a head injury or a toxin induced or something like that.
Carbon monoxide.
Yeah, carbon
poisoning,
monoxide poisoning.
stroke,
Near, like, unfortunately,
TBI.
Things that we've seen in our office, like near fatal drownings.
Yeah.
Heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. Massive traumas to the head and face. We've seen things like that where kids are, in car accidents, or kids get kicked in like one kid kicked in the face by a horse, and it's just like absolutely
Golf club
devastating.
to the frontal cortex.
Yeah, golf clubs,
Seen
things falling on people's heads,
Yeah.
things, why do some of those people end up with just a concussion, where it's just like a passing phase, an inflammatory issue in the brain, versus some, it kickstarts this horrible downward spiral,
So
right?
So let's keep that kind of premise, I think, for a little bit. When I talk on mitochondria, I think
Yeah.
remember this whole premise, like why can some people bounce back quickly from pretty substantial events, and then why do some people have less substantial initial events that cause the injury but don't bounce back very well? Because I think that's really a factor that's poorly understood, but I think there's some explanation behind it, and I think that's where we can kind of touch on, where can we look for some of that explanation. And so acquired, obviously neurobehavioral or developmental, is there one that you feel like is being underserved at all in the community, or are they all just need more work?
So I think one of the big things is they're trying to be looked at as so different, right? Like you have this diagnosis, therefore you get this treatment. You get this diagnosis, therefore you get this treatment. I think one of the things that is underrepresented is the development of the brain itself and the chemistry that goes into it, and how similar the neurochemistry is between a person with dyslexia, and a lot of times it's like they come in with signs of multiple neurodevelopmental disorders. So for instance, like tic disorders, I think a lot of the research says like 90 to 95% of kids have a tic disorder.
Yep.
It's just, is that tic disorder socially acceptable
Or disruptive?
Right? Disruptive. Is it something like a tic disorder, a vocal tic disorder? Obviously, like everyone thinks of Tourette's, and
what about, from working with the spine, how many people you always see kind of
constantly
pop
twitch
in
their neck or go forward with their neck, or probably the most common one, the hard blink. Basically just like it's usually some sort of facial or cervical tic disorder, where it's like a little head twitch, and that just shows you how important it is and how high up into the brainstem those abnormalities are. So it's not in the hands, it's not usually in the feet, it's usually closer to midline, telling you the structures of the brain that are probably involved too.
So if you look at, again, probably one of the most wide known ones, autism in the spectrum. I mean, if you just look at the prevalence rate of that since the 90s, was it 1 in 10,000, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 100, 1 in 88, 1 in 50, 1 in 50, 55 males to 1 in 34? Was it 1 in 17 males will be diagnosed with it?
And in particular parts of the country, like there's interesting things, because now you're starting to see like a genetic pull towards it, where it's like you didn't prior see so much of a genetic predisposition, but like places where it's a lot of people with very particular types of jobs or personalities, where you have someone who's very left brain in Silicon Valley, California, having kids with someone else who's very left brain in Silicon Valley, California, and it's like now you're seeing a drastic increase, in addition to it's being, the valley is famous for their horrible air conditions, in their air quality. So there's so many things that can go into it. So trying to do one treatment for one problem just goes out the window.
Well, and I think it's what causes it, and I think this is a conversation we can get very controversial about, and this is not what this talk's really about. You look at 80,000 chemicals have been put on this earth, 25% have been tested by the EPA.
Hardly.
And even then, there's issues with the 25% have been approved. We may find out later, that was an issue.
Yeah, whoops.
And again, that's kind of been, of course, through time. And I think that the issue, when you look at mothers, there's just more things being thrown at us on a chemical basis day to day. Diet is curved down in terms of the quality of it. And then you introduce chemicals into diet when that's supposed to be building us back and nourishing us. It's not really doing that. So I feel like there's a lot of things, and it's sad because it's incredibly disruptive. Divorce rates are through the roof.
Significantly elevated. And everyone's like, oh, divorce rate's 50%, but it's significantly higher in parents that have developmentally delayed, specifically autistic spectrum disorders.
So In terms of, is there any therapies when it comes to, or tests, an exam wise, what's that exam look like for a kid coming in with just a neurobehavioral disorder, whether it's autism, ADHD? Are they different exams? Are there any like similar components? And just if you hear thunder, there's a storm rolling through right now, so you may hear the microphone hopefully drowns out most of it, but just.
So I like to think of it as like, all of these neurodevelopmental disorders, the developmental disorder aspect of itself comes from the improper development of typically frontal lobes.
Mm-hmm.
And when we don't have those frontal lobes developing, from an exam perspective, primitive reflexes is a beautiful way of helping us understand what parts of the brain are working well and what parts of the brain are working not so well, and even what parts of the brain are working too well.
So let's touch on those, because
Yeah.
I think, I had a boy in today and he's got a asymmetric tonic neck reflex that's still present, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times, when should the last of these reflexes really disappear, right? They start to disappear around 3 months?
3
all the way up
months
to about a
to
year,
about a
2 year
year
and a
or so,
half.
yeah.
So, and again, let's go into that conversation and let's look, when did the CDC in the last year or so, they kind of push back a lot of the developmental milestones,
Yeah.
which again, for us as providers, like, we should be all sounding an alarm. One of our national health agencies that gives us recommendations is now saying, hey, look, you used to walk at this age, you used to crawl at this age, you used to hold your head up at this age. We don't know why, but we're just going to push them back 6 months. And again, it's like, are we making even bigger steps in the wrong direction in neurodevelopment?
Well, it's just becoming so common that they consider it normal.
But
And I think that's the biggest problem with those. Like, it's so common that it's just normal now. And at what point are we going to say, let's stop this and realize that ADHD is not normal, autism is not normal, and these developmental milestones that have been there for literally decades, and they're getting pushed back by 3 months. Like, learning to roll instead of being at 3 months is now 6 months.
Yeah.
It's like, that is,
it's the same thing.
being able to sit is being pushed back, being able to walk is being pushed back.
Testosterone and like everything, and it's not just neurodevelopment. Like,
Mm-hmm.
testosterone in men is on a steady decline. 20-year-old men have testosterone levels of 80-year-old men more often, and it's just a onslaught of issues that are coming up, and not enough of an emphasis of finding out why. It's too much of an emphasis to me it's like, here's a quick solution, and we need to be pumping the brakes and trying to start digging into what's going on. And again, I think at the cell level, is there something going on at the cell level or in the plan to develop and take care of physiology that people are doing to disrupt it, the environment is doing, or something in the middle? And so
when you start adding all those factors in, you can see how, like, it's so difficult for someone to get all the answers that they need because of all the different types of specialties and lenses people are looking through. But taking a step back and getting the 10,000 foot view of, like, why is my kid having these neurodevelopmental challenges, and how can we stop that, what's going on? Number one, we have to do some types of tests to figure out what it is.
So going back into the test side of things,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the primitive reflexes, and so there's a series of primitive reflexes. Dr. Robert Malelo is a big advocate of this. He's taught us how to go through, assess them, and the cool part is they give you information, and then a lot of times if they have that primitive reflex still, so like one example is the Rugen reflex. You rub on the cheek or of a baby and they turn to it, because again, it helps them find the nipple to feed. And so it makes sense when we're fresh out of the womb needing a reflex to get us to survive, right? And so these neck reflexes again help us get through the birth canal.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, after we've been birthed, we should start to have brain development that shuts them down. And so they're a very good neurological assessment tool, because if they're present, obviously then development has been kind of steered off course.
Exactly.
And so, what are the, which ones do you tend to look at on a given exam?
For sure, the asymmetric tonic neck reflex, which is when you turn your head, you should have your brain should be able to perceive the difference between head motion and body motion. And I like to look at it in kids when they're on all fours, because if you turn your head and their elbow just consistently gives out, that's telling you that that reflex from the right side or the left side is not getting inhibited by the cortex. The brain is not perceiving the body as individual parts, but as the head turns to the left, the body goes to the left automatically.
Can you do that one standing up as well?
You can do that one standing
So
up
more
as well.
like Frankenstein, turn.
Exactly. Babinski reflex is another really good one, and you can use that one for
A lot of
I mean, we use it with concussion patients. We use it with people that have degenerative disorders or potential strokes, and it was originally looked at from is the brain able to inhibit the brain stem functions?
the Babinski reflex is a withdrawal.
It's a type of withdrawal reflex from
something unpleasant.
Something unpleasant on the bottom of the foot in particular. So when you rub the bottom of the foot on the outside of the heel up to the big toe, if you see a big toe going up and the other toe is kind of like spraying out, and like an extension reflex, then you know that there's potential lack of inhibition from the opposite side cortex. So that's something that you look at, and then you can say, okay, well, if the opposite side cortex isn't inhibiting that, maybe that left side cortex or that right side cortex isn't doing other functions as well.
Like, let's kind of roll on the left-hand side of this and kind of create an exam off of this, right?
Yeah.
And so, on the left side, they maybe have expressive language issues, receptive language issues.
Maybe some memory problems.
Would it be more likely some dyslexic kid?
Some dyslexias and some, usually if it's like left brain deficient, maybe there could be some anxieties with it as well.
Now, with the primitive reflexes, when they're present, do they kind of go together with clusters of symptoms?
Generally, they're going to go hand in hand with symptoms, and you can see it when you're doing, whether it's primitive reflex reintegration exercises that help kind of get rid of those reflex, things that we were supposed to do as babies. So all the time I ask patients with kids that were developmentally delayed, how soon did they walk? How soon did they crawl? How long did they crawl? And the parents are always like, oh, they walked really early. Quick walker.
Trip them.
Yeah.
Don't let them crawl.
Crawling and getting that cross crawl reflex is unbelievably massive and important for brain development. And when you don't crawl and you just go straight to bipedal walking, we don't learn to swing our arms appropriately. Our brain doesn't learn to integrate and have correct balance and posture. It doesn't learn to have correct balance and gait. I mean, there's so many things that are important. It doesn't help us basically learn the extension postures that our low back and our neck need, so we don't get the curvatures that we need. So these are kids that end up having like slumped posture all the time.
And a lifetime of spinal injuries. Like that's the other side of it, right? I mean,
early degeneration of cervical and lumbar spine.
You're looking at a lifetime of just, there's the learning and behavioral type disorders, but there's the potential for back, postural rehab.
Exactly. Like scoliosis, for sure. If you don't develop the lordotic curvatures of your neck and low back, you're going to end up developing lateral curvatures with those things too.
You touched on something about arm swing, and I think it's interesting because, we're talking about how important it is to see the development of arm swing, and again, how important. And I just came back from a trip, walking through the airport. And again, it's just, you see so much at the airport. Like, there's no arm swing, or there's, they're kind of short, quick steps. They're kind of swinging their leg in a pendulous gait. And you can start to piece apart kind of what's going on. And so, if they don't develop arm swing as a kid, and then I'm not saying this is what's going to come in, but what if somebody loses arm swing as an adult? What do you start to think about?
I mean, that's some type of frontal demise, right? Frontotemporal demise of some sort, where we're losing the ability to move our body in an appropriate manner. Like, our left arm is supposed to swing forward when our right leg swings forward as a counterbalancing system, and it's intended to do that as a reflex. And when we don't have that reflex, I mean, watch, and this is its hallmark in patients with any type of neurodegeneration.
Parkinson's is a big one.
Parkinson's is definitely a big one. You see it in anyone with any kind of
I
frontal
mean,
lobe.
we had a patient who, this is probably a decade ago, 9 years ago, and we did a health talk. He wanted to come in, work with us, kind of get healthier, clean up diet, and just from us reading his intake form, he had micrographia, so some
Yep.
really small
Jittery
jittery writing that definitely got worse as he used it. And then kind of like we turned to look outside and we saw him walking, and he had no arm swing on the left side arm, and he was almost shuffling his gait
Yep.
and had to stop to kind of collect himself and go. I mean, we ended up referring him to the neurological facility here in Dallas because he ended up getting diagnosed with Parkinson's, and you could see it on the paperwork, you could see it on his gait, and you can see it if you look and you just observe and you take the time to watch for things. And again, you know what's normal, and when it deviates from normal, you need to start looking deeper. And it's the same thing in kind of going back to kids, right? When normal development is not going up the mountain like they should, you don't just kind of, oh, they're cute. Like we need to stop and get them for a very good exam.
Absolutely.
And try to isolate. Is it one region? Is it a part of the brain, or is it diffuse in multiple areas?
Yeah.
So reflex wise, so let's say you find a reflex or a primitive reflex that's retained, it's still there. The cool part is it something that they're just stuck with, or can you do things to get
Absolutely.
it rehabbed out?
No, that's the beautiful thing about it is the brain working on the basis of plasticity. The more you use something, the more efficient it becomes. So if you can do something, and this is how we, like for instance, the Babinski reflex, when we learn to stand, you see babies stand up on their toes when they're kind of doing the shuffling on the couch or using the coffee table to help kind of like keep them upright. They'll stand and you'll see them stand on their toes, and then eventually they'll be up on their toes so much that the stimulation isn't causing the reflex, and they'll go flat on their feet. But then once they hit their feet, they go back up on up on their toes, and you see that happen. But eventually what happens is they stimulate it so much that your brain goes, hey, I don't need to have this toe walking reflex anymore. Same thing with every reflex. We just need to use it enough and get that stimulation enough that we lose the reflex because it's no longer beneficial to have that reflex.
Well, from a therapy standpoint, this is the fun part of kind of doing neurobehavior, like basically playing in the world of neuroplasticity. You can give a targeted therapy that's trying to get to a region of the brain and excite it, and then you can go right back and test the reflex that was there and see if it's improved or dampened or gone.
Yeah.
And so the parents get to see it, and guess what? Does that exercise become homework?
And sometimes it's like 30 seconds too.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's super fast. Sometimes there's other things holding it back, but a lot of times it's pretty quick. Usually within a few visits, if not the same visit, you can see a drastic decrease. And then if you give them the homework of, hey, I want you to do this one exercise or these two exercises, very like just doing it multiple times a day, not for a long period of time each time, but multiple times a day, of basically driving that activation, that proper stimulus to activate the brain. And then the beautiful thing is it's not just inhibiting that reflex, but it's stimulating the part of the brain that gives them attention, or gives them impulsivity control, or it gives them compulsivity abilities to not just jump from target to target. And the problem is and the research shows us very clearly, ADHD kids become anxious adults. Right? Your brain is going 1,000 miles per hour going, what's this, what's this, what's this, what's this? And unfortunately, as we develop, we begin to get the ability to stay on topic a little bit better, but that jump from target to target to target, or that thing to thing to thing, ends up becoming an overactive brain, as in like I'm just thinking too much about too many things. This is classic like 18 to 25-year-old who's just become an anxious person.
Yep.
Now, what is also happening during those times is college and high stress, and then you throw in some alcohol, or you start throwing in some all-nighters and lack of sleep, and more and more
stimulants.
stress about like more mature, more adult issues, and all of a sudden, anxiety.
Finances.
Yeah.
Things start to get real.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's when it snowballs into anxiety as a young adult.
Right, but again, the writing is probably on the wall.
Yeah,
Before
decades.
that.
Usually by about 5 to 7 years old, these symptoms are starting to show up. Teachers are usually starting to say, "Hey, he's good and he's smart, but he's got this." And I'm saying he because, I mean, boys are significantly more likely to develop these neurodevelopmental disorders than most of the neurodevelopmental disorders than girls.
Yeah. Do you think there's other things like, on the exam, obviously we talked about the primitive reflexes. What are other key ingredients or key essential parts that should be a part of every exam?
I think, balance and coordination, because oftentimes, I ask this all the time, and this is like one of the first things that I ask kids. I got, just this week I had a 7 or 8 year old boy in front of me. I asked him, like, how do you feel like you do in class before recess versus after recess? And his mom was immediately like, I know the answer to this one, because every teacher after recess is saying, Johnny's a great little kid. He's the smartest kid in the class. All the teachers say he's the smartest kid in the class after recess, but all the ones before recess are saying, he can't stay on topic, he's disruptive.
He's the butt of the little Johnny jokes.
Yeah, exactly. And it just shows you that balance and coordination, or at least the stimulation of that movement and that activity, is going to be so important for the development of the brain. And just like a puppy, like you got to take your puppy out for walks and run them around and get them tired, and then they'll be really good dogs. But if you don't exercise a young dog, they're going to chew up the house.
Usually a bad distracted dog is a bored dog, right?
Yeah.
The brain's not being challenged enough.
Exactly. So, balance and coordination plays a role. Vestibular exercise. Your vestibular system is one of the first sensory systems that function. We already know, like, for instance, we know that parents, like moms who are, put on bed rest in the last trimester, are about 3 or 4 times more likely to have kids with ADHD or neurodevelopmental disorders than moms who exercise regularly during the 3rd trimester.
So kind of talking about vestibular development and that study, when does the vestibular system start to develop?
Super early. Super early. There's some research that says by 8 weeks you're perceiving movement.
Right, so you're detecting gravity.
You're feeling mom jostle you around.
So mom being active and having some, basically, it's a workout already.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. You're stimulating the brain to get feedback, and that's, taking it down to the basics. The brain's sole purpose is to take in stimulus and then help us kind of do something to manipulate the environment or to adapt to that stimulus. If something feels hot, I want to pull my hand away. If something is, if something tastes good, I want to eat more of it, right? So I think the brain's ability to perceive is the first thing that needs to happen before we have an expectation that the brain is going to function appropriately.
So kind of something that, when we work with people, and again, try to break it down how we develop, right? And so we don't develop fine motor skills in the hand and then come in centrally and get spinal control.
Exactly.
It's the opposite. And so again, it's kind of back to, you want the kid holding the head up well, you want crawling to be in place before you get them doing a bunch of fork to mouth, like fine motor skills. But it's interesting because, again, I use that kind of correlation because fine motor skills and that part of the cerebellum and coordination center ties into what? Emotional regulation, all these other higher brain things. And again, so if they're not well coordinated, again, what do you think might be on the horizon line?
Exactly.
Emotional anxiety control, and so it's a good neurological exam is so valuable. And I think the other issue, though, is it's a good one. Looking at, here's the exam if the person had a hard signal or a hard sign, aka they had a stroke or a pathological lesion. Then there's a neurological exam where you're just comparing side to side. Is it symmetrical? And then is it not right? I mean, again, it may not be pathological. So you may not have continuous like clonus in the wrist, but do you have a little bit of it, and it's only on the left but not the right?
Exactly.
And I think that's where
Yeah.
we look for such clear-cut exams versus just slowing down to take such a deep look and going side to side, symmetry left versus right. You know, is there still a slight hint of clonus when there shouldn't be at all?
Yeah, and even taking it a step further, like the autonomic side of things, you know, putting a pulse ox on each finger, one on each finger, and looking and like, okay, it's 99% on this side. Why is it only 95% on this side? And it happens so much more commonly than people think. But if you only have one on one finger and they go, oh, 99%, and you just assume
It's good.
that it's good on both sides, then it's kind of like taking blood pressure. We always take blood pressure on both sides. And it's like, if I had a stroke on this side, you might see changes in one side or the other, depending on where the stroke is at.
And so, on that, again, I mean, I think that's a good thing too for parents at home doing exercises. You know, if you want to make sure you're not exceeding what your kid can handle on the metabolic side of things, which again is the other aspect I think is worth talking about before we get, you know, too long into this, is, you know, the very basic function is like, are you still able to distribute oxygen to the tissues? If you start to see that drop, like, is the brain suffering as well? And that's why, again, Dr. Nutt, and when we stress on using the pulse ox to keep an eye on things, is if it starts to drop down, I mean, you're going to see fatigue.
Yeah,
and at that point,
and it can happen very quick.
Yeah, the eyes might gloss over, but that's like that point between being therapeutic to just pushing somebody too hard, to having an emotional outburst in a younger kid, to having somebody just get a headache or hangry. Like there's a whole bunch of potential issues that can show up.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, you know, brain like a race car engine, but at the end, there's only so much gas in the tank. If you push the gas pedal for too long, you just run out of fuel. Right, and when it dies quick, and that's kind of happens with our brain too. And you know, that's where when we start looking at more the neurometabolic side of things, and you know, that's where your specialty comes into play. And I think that's where, you know, when I think about like neurological testing, when it comes to blood work, like, is there anything on blood work that you like to look at, like anything that you find that, like, here's someone comes in and it's like they got all these blood work, you know, blood tests done, but they're missing some of the major things. Is there anything, you know, any tests or any markers that you're like, this needs to be looked at?
So kind of, when you picture health in general, I think, you know, there's a lot of people that teach and divide things up, and really I think when you come back down to, you know, if somebody has, you know, a thyroid problem, a gut issue, low hormone function, I mean, it's really what's it impacting, right? It's really, that message is going back to the cell, right? We're 38 trillion cells that need to get along, need to take our calories, and need to make energy. And so if we can do those things, and we can make the energy so we can continue to make the protein, to make the connections, or make the muscle, or make the hormones, life is good. I mean, that whole story is how good you break down a cell that has gone bad, if it may be a cancerous cell. And so, you know, if you have a kid that's just showing fatigue, again, you got to start thinking that there is potentially a feeding a brain problem. And so we can get very complicated with it, but even on the most basic lab panel, we need to look at their ability and the health of the red blood cell and their oxygen carrying capacity. You know, are there any shifts that's starting to kind of go away in the red blood cell, the hemoglobin, hematocrit, the characteristics of the red blood cell? Is there anything that's starting to, you know, so iron and ferritin, transferritin, TIBC, like iron saturation, how are those numbers looking? Because again, guess what? So when you look at our body, the brain, the liver, and skeletal muscle have the highest density or the highest number of mitochondria, and those are the energy producing parts of our body that keep us living, right? And so if somebody was to get carbon monoxide poisoning, you're really poisoning the mitochondria as well. And again, if you're in that moment long enough, you don't make ATP, you die pretty quickly actually. So again, when you picture why it's so essential to have a red blood cell that can do its job and oxygen to be there, and then even going back to the pulse ox, it comes down to the cell and the ability to take the calories we eat to make the ATP to run everything. So anemias and oxygen have to be thoroughly looked. Blood sugar is the other thing, right? I mean, 20 to 25% of your glucose is used by this 3-pound organ sitting on our shoulders, the brain. And so, again, if somebody fasts, do they feel worse? Do they get more behavioral? Do they sleep through the night or wake up kind of wired? Those are all early signs and free signs.
And every neurological patient will tell you, I get hangry really easy. I can't go much longer than 2 or 3 hours without eating.
I wake up with my heart racing in the middle of the night. But then the sad part is, again, a lot of times with kids with behavioral disorders, for the kid to listen, they get a treat. And I think that's the sad part, because the mom's trying to do things to reinforce positive behavior, but then the brain is not getting the fuel to keep on going with the behavior. And so I think that's something we see probably quite a bit. We're like, I get it, but like, this, we need to make sure blood sugar is good, right? And so
breaking out the Honey Nut Cheerios or breaking out the Goldfish or something like that.
Even the organic version of a Skittle without the dye and all that stuff is great, but it's still sugar that's coming with the crash. So blood sugar needs to be thoroughly checked. Get a fasting insulin, getting, what's their fasting blood sugar? Can they keep it up? Not too high. Those are some basic metrics. And then honestly, homocysteine is a very valuable one, because again, this tells you about pathways that look into your ability to methylate. And again, methylation is critical for many reasons. If your kid has food allergies, you have to be able to methylate to degrade histamine, right? And so this, if you have heavy metals, you ate some sushi, methylation is one of the pathways you clear it out. So we could have a 4-day course on just how critical methylation is, but let's say there is some genetic vulnerability in play, and the mitochondria aren't doing well. We have 2 sets of DNA in the body. We have our DNA that's passed on from mom and dad, stored in the nucleus of the cell and kind of protected, but our mitochondrial DNA is more exposed. And so the problem is when the mitochondria start to have issues making the energy, that mitochondrial DNA gets dinged, and you start to see these things start to the bad deck of cards we might have in there start to get played. So recovery kind of slows down, and aka behavior may start to get worse as these things prolong. So that kind of leads me to, I love to look at mitochondrial markers. A nodes test or an organic acid test gives you a wealth of information. If you have succinic acid elevated, you start thinking of, basically you're having issues getting into the Krebs cycle of the mitochondria. You start thinking, are there toxicities? So again, are there environmental toxins? Are there heavy metals? Then that kind of leads you down other rabbit holes. Can they use fat as a fuel? So, can they even maintain a fast and go after stored energy? And again, these are such critical things.
So with a lot of the neurodevelopmental disorder patients that we get, I'll start having the conversation while doing some type of therapy or doing the exam. I'm sitting there kind of having a side conversation with the parents and saying, how about, have you had any methylation testing done? And then almost always they go, no testing, but we give them methylfolate.
But how do you know if it's enough?
And I always tell people, MTHFR SNPs are the tip of the iceberg. It goes so much deeper.
Yeah, it's the low-hanging fruit that's easy to go after.
Kind of the first one brought into the mainstream as well. I think MTHFR started coming out in the late 90s, early 2000s, where people were doing real testing for it and seeing results when they supplemented it, for sure.
And so if you had that gene or that version that was slower at doing its job, because that's really what it does, it slows down your ability for you to take dietary folate and convert it into the working form. And if you can't do that as well, you can look at homocysteine as a potential marker, like, am I supporting it well enough? And if you see that high, say climbing above 7, you're probably not supporting that well enough. to kind of offset what that, the gene is doing. So yeah, if you're taking it but you're not kind of looking in to see if you're doing it, and then too, are they absorbing it? A lot of times if they're anxious and they're just go, like you just worry about their gut health is usually an issue as well. And so, you may not just be able to give them a capsule, you might have to find two delivery methods to kind of reach the goal. But yeah, genetics, your epigenetic factors are big. I mean, again, and the one thing that is very common when we look at these organic acid tests that come back are these markers tied back to your oxidation pathways. They always have like pyroglutamic acid is like high, which is telling you like your ability to clean up waste in the cell is compromised. So glutathione's wiped out and depleted, which again, when we make energy, it's not perfect, right? If I gave him a molecule of glucose, he's going to create hydrogen peroxide and superoxide anions, which are very damaging if you just let them sit. But we have glutathione and these antioxidants that come in and kind of clear them out. So when you start to see certain metabolites go high, it just tells you that's not happening. The problem is in the mitochondria, if you start to see that happen, that mitochondrial DNA is right there, and you start to damage that mitochondrial DNA and turn on more bad things or more vulnerabilities. So it's why I think that's probably the other biggest test that at least is a starting point, because it doesn't end there.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if that kid, if you had a kid come in with Tourette's, OCD, ADHD, what tests are you going to run on?
Definitely looking at an organic acid test as the foundation, in addition to a little bit more comprehensive blood work. The blood work that you were talking about, definitely the homocysteine side of things. Probably, in my mind, looking at omega fatty acid ratios.
Omega fatty acids. Yeah, I mean, when you look at what DHA does to stabilize the neurological membranes, it's huge, plus myelin. But I mean, I was kind of alluding to the Cunningham panel, right? If somebody comes in and they're having kind of even more specific clusters, then you're starting to think, is there a neuroautoimmune mechanism or pandas?
Yeah. And that's where, just to kind of give a brief description, basically it's messing up the communication between neurotransmitters in your basal ganglia with dopamine. Dopamine is hitting what are called D1 and D2 receptors. I always tell people D1 receptors are like your gas pedal, and D2 receptors are like your brake pedal, and you got to kind of have a little bit of pressure on both of them. If you want your brain to be really excited, you push the gas a little bit harder, and maybe you take your foot off the brakes a little bit. If you want to be falling asleep and having like a normal circadian rhythm, you kind of flip-flop and maybe you push the brake pedal a little bit and take your foot off the gas pedal. But in these types of pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with strep, you start seeing problems with the D2 receptors and autoimmunity, where the immune system itself starts tearing up those D2 receptors. Now all you have is the gas pedal.
You have less ability to hit the brake.
Yeah.
Which again, it's one of those things where it's so critical to get on and find that early, and that's why again the whole pandas world. I mean, it's getting more awareness, but again, if you doubt that it's real, get to a conference where they show you the research. Get with Dr. Cunningham, because again, I mean, the research on it's been there. It's been there for a couple decades.
Sure.
She's busted her tail to demonstrate it, reproduce it, shows that you can have strep antibodies do it to the D2 receptors, and
knowing that there's hope for it too, because when it comes down to it, autoimmunity is an immune system problem.
Yep.
Right. So it's not just, hey, you have a strep-induced symptom, so let's give you heavy antibiotic to kill off that strep.
How does strep get to the brain?
But exactly, how did that strep get, and how did that immune response get to the brain as well? Like, how did, do we have a leaky blood-brain barrier? Are we letting peripheral immune system migrate to the central nervous system? Are we having autoimmune processes in other places as well? Because typically these kids are also having skin issues, or every one of them has significant gut problems.
Yeah, and food allergies. And
food allergies, sensitivities. They almost, and the nice part is they almost all come in with, I'm already gluten-free.
Yep.
And it's like, great.
And it helps. Like a
it
lot
helps.
of them, like
it absolutely does.
It helped, or it helped for 3 years, and then kind of got older, got more hormones into the system, and development kept on pushing, but it was not enough to necessarily corral like the fire or the
Yeah.
issue going on.
Reminds me of an episode that we should do is probably just like gut health, because when
Yeah.
I hear you talk about the breakdown and how leaky gut happens, it just fires me up.
Well, we can do that maybe on a cooler night and a different day.
On a cooler night would be good.
I mean, again, what we really have this passion, and I think would be cool to do, is take an education and just really kind of go down to when people have like leaky gut, you know, kind of what are all the spokes off the wheel that's impacted? You know, why can that make people feel so crummy? Because again, I think it's one of those things where it's like, well, yeah, it messes with absorption. It increases your inflammatory cytokines. It, you know, again, you start opening the door for foods to become a reaction to, and that just does what? Puts more gas pedal down on this inflammatory loop. But again, really what suffers, right? And again, to me, when you go and you comb through the literature, it's really these, you know, the influence of that inflammatory cytokine on the cell and that cell's ability to take our energy and produce it and to stay healthy. And so everything, I think, when you start to really kind of look at, you know, if somebody has a compromised like blood-brain barriers, like, you know, they probably have a compromised gut barrier. And it's just having, you know, what's the solution? I mean, one, what's breaking it down? What's chipping away at it? What's making them vulnerable? Are there any biochemical processes making it vulnerable? Are there any, you know, psychiatric conditions making it vulnerable? Because if you're anxious, are you at a higher risk for GI disruption?
Absolutely.
I mean, scared shitless is there for a reason, that expression,
Absolutely.
right? And so, and I think that's the hard part. And again, I'm not sure if you ever sense that, but when you talk with patients and you just kind of try to explain, like, well, you know, I don't know why I have like gut issues. When you told me you had anxiety since you're 12, and now this is 8 years later. At some point, you're just slowly decreasing blood flow and basically repair to the gut over time. And it's just, I think sometimes it's hard for them to understand the neurological connection between gut and brain and gut brain. And I think that's just one of those things where, I mean, the autonomic side of things is huge.
Unbelievably huge. And that's, you know, that goes back, ties in with some of the primitive reflex side of things, because if you have some of these, because typically most of the primitive reflexes are going to be stemming from upper brainstem. Right? They're going to be coming from more mesocephalic areas or maybe upper pons areas, but most of them are going to be coming from upper brainstem, which, you know, is oftentimes associated with, not always in all cases, but oftentimes associated with more kind of like what's called the mesolimbic pathway, basically like this pathway that causes a stress response. Your limbic system is like your primitive, hardwired emotional responses. It's kind of like, you know, it's part of the PTSD loop. It's part of the, you know, it's part of the abuse loop, and a part of, and when we have these traumas, you know, this is a whole nother realm that you can dive into, is like
We'll touch on this another one.
Yeah, how traumas can induce these changes in brain function to put us into these fight or flight modes for a prolonged period of time.
And again, I always say this to people all the time. What's your brain's first job?
Protection.
Keep you alive, right?
Keep you alive.
When you come out of the womb, you're crying, temperamental, not, you know, you don't get food, wah, you cry, you have a wet diaper, you're uncomfortable, it's just ballistic, right? And so, again, as you get better brain development, you have a quieting of those ballistic emotions. But again, if things start to tell your brain things are not safe, or there's a threat, you start seeing these loops. So PTSD or trauma, and then things that might even mimic that original trauma can be enough just to alert your brain that to be on alert, yet it's safe. And I think that's a whole other topic and a whole other level of complexity behind chronic health issues. Because I think, I mean, I know a lot, I mean, how many times does somebody come in and maybe they didn't have the physical or the emotional trauma, but the concussion that never got better became
Their trauma.
their abuse, right? And again, and they're so, it just allowed this wind up, or their autoimmune issue, you know, health, the chronic health issue is the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, they start, the linguistics, how they talk. Oh, I'm sick, I'm this, and your subconscious is
literally
always
saying,
listening.
I am inflamed, I am injured, I am dysfunctional of some sort. And it's,
that protective part of your brain, that subconscious is listening.
yeah.
And so if you water that part of that, if you water it with those words and those thoughts, and I think we've had great success when we get patients referred off to people who are really good at handling that.
Yeah.
It speeds up the patient's progress significantly.
Absolutely.
And something that we probably did not refer out to enough 5 years ago. It's really been better the last 3 years.
We literally have like 3 different psychologist cards sitting on our front desk right now.
It's a huge resource, and it's a part of any chronic game plan for people to get better.
For sure.
All right, so kind of testing wise, I had a couple other thoughts. I think, I think if you see your child with behavior or development that's not great, I also take their temperature every day in the morning at the same time. If it's always 99.4, again, is there some low grade but chronic immune aspect behind it? Is there something going on?
Absolutely.
Because again, then it's just, let's look for it, let's figure it out.
And it doesn't have to be strep. It doesn't have to be full on pandas. It could be
Lyme. It can be a whole host of mold.
Mold. It could be candidas. It could be other just chronic viral infections. It could be Coxsackie virus, which is like hand, foot, and mouth disease, is unbelievably common in preschool age kids, right? So it's like you go to the daycare and you can't bring little Johnny to school anymore because he's got hand, foot, and mouth. All the little, basically looks like chicken pox around just the mouth and the hands and the feet. And I think that's we've seen enough of these chronic viral infections that just it's a heavy straw on the camel's back. And then you give a little bit of malnourishment, you give a little bit of epigenetic changes, you get a little bit of stress or stressors or hypo or hyperglycemia, oxygenation issues, puberty, changes in normal function, and add some stress in there, or a trauma, a head injury or something like that, and it can really unravel.
Going back into just kind of questions for parents to kind of ask yourself of, hey, how did my kid do after he got sick? Like, were they doing well from a behavioral standpoint, kind of steady, making progress in school, and then did a viral or a bacterial thing come across and set them backwards, and then have they really regressed and not come out of it? Because that's another sign. Like, is there an immune aspect to what's going on in the neurobehavioral disorder? Because I think those are these little windows in that give you insight on where to look deeper. And again, so if you're a parent listening, kind of think back and be like, yeah, you know what, Johnny had strep and it's never been the same. And it's been this, like, he was doing better, he was going through therapy, he was stable. It may also tell you kind of what might have ruffled or started this story to begin with, or at least a significant player. And again, if you don't know your blind spots, I think that's the big thing that we talk with patients about. Is our journey is about discovering your blind spots and your weaknesses. If you don't isolate them and discover them, there are always blind spots in your vulnerabilities. And whether it's a kid to an adult, we need to have this journey of, through life, of knowing your blind spots, like where are your weaknesses. If you suck at balancing a checkbook, figure somebody out to balance the checkbook. When it comes to health, it's no different.
Absolutely.
So, do you have any kind of last pointers, advice for parents in terms of, kind of just what can they be doing that's just supportive on an everyday basis? Or
I think there's so many good resources out there from a how to fuel a brain for dummies type books, right? Like, there's so many things that can give you good information about, hey, make sure you're getting these nutrients, make sure you're, like, how to fuel your brain, like how to oxygenate your brain, and making sure your kids are staying active. Like, a lot of people ask me all the time because of the concussion training and TBI stuff that I do, does my kid play contact sports? And I said absolutely. Like, I grew up playing contact sports, you grew up playing contact sports, and I'm not saying, like, maybe I'm not saying we're the lucky few, because we both have had our little dings into the head and diagnosable concussions, but
that's, to me, this is where I go back to knowing your blind spots. Like, I know I've done these things. I know things that kind of can help me, like whether it's fasting or doing things to help my brain kind of clear out the damage, and then also knowing what lab markers to tell me, like, hey, look, this is stress on the brain, and I might have had some concussions, so let's not do that.
So, having a general basis of nutrition, if you don't have a general basis of nutrition, or you want to talk to someone about a general basis of nutrition, like, please reach out to us, or reach out to someone that you know or trust that can give you information about brain health and brain function from a nutrition side of things.
And I will say, like, the last 10 years of that has exploded. Like, I think the IFM has put together a kind of revolution on the nutrition pyramid, the food pyramid in the nutrition world. Because I think, for a while there, it's like, yeah, follow the food pyramid. It's like
food pyramid,
and let me smash my head against the wall, kind of type of response. But again, I feel like there's been a very good tide and educational shift, at least a good enough level. Maybe not at your traditional institutional levels yet. It's still not great in most, but I think those who want to get that education, there's more functional nutritionists and people like that are more targeted from a brain to an autoimmune standpoint out there.
For sure. And there's from a nutrition side of things, I think that's huge. And then getting baselines, right? Like, it's never too early to get blood work done, fairly comprehensive blood work done. I don't think it's abnormal to be saying, like, I just want to make sure not only is my kid not going to get any of these things, but they're also just optimizing. I think optimization should be the first thing on our minds, not necessarily just being reactive to, hey, there might be a problem, but being proactive of saying, is there anything that we can make improvements on? If your kid's already super smart or super athletic or both, you can always improve things and help fuel and oxygenate and stimulate the brain even better.
And on that baseline, I mean, if you think your kid's 5 and it's young for them to have testing, okay, like, that's the worst. Like, seeing a kid get a blood draw if it's not something that's pleasant to them. But there's testing where you can get some lab markers through a finger prick or just a blood spot. And then the organic acid test it's a urine test. It's looking at, it might be hard for a boy that can't hit the toilet, but again, it's there you can get some really good information without being incredibly intrusive.
Exactly.
And so that shouldn't be a sticking point. Anyways, any other kind of thoughts before we sign off, move on?
This is, the passion for this. There's providers out there who can talk about these things the way that we're talking about. If you ever feel like this is something that you need help with that's beyond the traditional medical care, please reach out to us, because we have a network of people that we work with. And there's someone almost everywhere that can do something to help outside of just prescription pads and major kind of scary treatments. Drugs are not always and shouldn't always be the first solution.
Well, this kind of brings us to that fun time of every podcast. This is not medical advice. This does not mean to change anything without consulting your physician or your team. This is specifically for educational purposes, to help better serve you on your educational journey and empower you. So it may ask you to add new medical providers to your team. But yes, this is not to be taken as any specific healthcare device. So please, it's for educational purposes. This is always fun. We love to educate. If there's topics that you would like us to touch on, gut health is one that is easy. I think going through and doing one on epigenetics and just the environmental impact would be good. Things we can be doing to kind of going deeper down the rabbit hole in biohacking and what else can we be doing? How do we measure that?
Maybe protecting your own brain later in life and protecting, you know, a loved one's brain, a mom or dad or an aunt or an uncle or a grandma or someone like that who you're wanting them to be healthier before it gets too far down the road. I think, you know, that's something that we should probably have a conversation about too.
Cool part is we got a lot of good things in the works. Try to maybe even look at getting some educational content more on a weekend basis for providers, but even too morphing into like potentially looking at doing some type of retreat that's going to have a brain emphasis and a kind of a preventative emphasis to it in some cool places.
Yeah.
So
deep dive brain workshop.
And have a relaxing, beautiful vacation somewhere. That's kind of the mix. So
yeah,
we'll bug with us. So anyways, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you guys. Please go
subscribe
to this podcast. Please share this podcast with someone. Sometimes the best thing you can do is say, hey, I think, you know, I can't tell you how often it is where someone says, you know, I heard about you guys through a friend, or I heard about you guys through a loved one, and you know, it really makes a big impact in their health. And if all you got to do is hit the share button and send it to your mom or your dad or sister or brother or something like that, and it has a potential impact on their life or one of their kids' lives or something like that, you know, you can be part of the solution with this as well. And that's what we're doing these podcasts for, is to try to help give people answers when, you know, give people help and give people hope. Yeah.
So, well, until episode after this one, 11, episode 11. So, and we're going to be more regular about them now. We're back in the swing of things. We had some good things happening. So anyways, until next time, been a pleasure. We'll talk to you later.
Take care.